Welcome to the Women in Defence UK interview with the Chief of the Defence Staff, General Sir Nick Carter, which is taking place to mark the 10th anniversary of Women in Defence UK. I'm Angela Owen, I founded Women in Defence, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here today with General Sir Nick. Born in Nairobi, Kenya, you commissioned into the Royal Green Jackets in 1978 on an initial short service commission, which is for 3 years. And some 40 years on, you were appointed Chief of the Defence Staff, which isn't bad for a short service commission officer. We've just heard, in fact, that the new CDS will be Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, and you're due to hand over the reins by the end of November. I have a little understanding of how busy these last few months must have been, and I am so grateful to you for taking the time to be here today.
No, thanks, Angela. It's good to be with you and good to see you again. And I much look forward to talking about this really important issue.
Before we get into the interview proper, on the 18th of August, you were interviewed on Sky News by Kay Burley. In answer to a question about how you felt to be collaborating with the enemy when they'd carried out such atrocities against UK military personnel over the years, you said, and I'll quote part of the answer, "I think people need to understand who the Taliban actually are. And the plain fact is that they happen to live by a code of honor and a standard, which has been their standard for many, many years. It's called Pashtunwali. It has honor at the heart of what they do. They are bound together by a common purpose, which is that they don't like corrupt governance, they don't like governance that is self-serving, and they want an Afghanistan that is inclusive for all." Now, when the Taliban were last in power, women and girls were banned from going to school or studying, banned from working, banned from leaving the house without a male chaperone, banned from showing their skin in public, banned from receiving health care from a male doctor. If these laws were disobeyed, punishments were harsh. A woman could be flogged for showing an inch or two of skin, beaten for attempting to study, stoned to death if she was found guilty of adultery. Many women found the comment about a Taliban code of honor and honor at the heart of what they do utterly incompatible with what has happened in the past. To clarify, in your answer, were you in any way condoning or excusing the awful conditions under which women and girls lived with the Taliban?
No, of course not. Categorically not. What I was trying to do was to bring to life the way they see the world. And in order to get people to understand that at this particular point in time, it may well be that some of them see things differently. And the point I wanted to make really was that Afghanistan has changed a lot over the last 20 years. 60% of Afghans have been born since the Taliban were last in charge. And they have all experienced a much more inclusive world than the world that women experienced before 2001. And I think we have to hope, I'm not optimistic, but we have to hope that maybe they will see things differently. Now, all of the indications are at the moment that there are a lot of people who aren't seeing it like that, but maybe there will be some that do. And what we have to do is to give people hope. And that's where I'm coming from on this. And I've spent 3 years of my life in Afghanistan, spent 3 years of that time trying to further the rights of everybody in Afghanistan and to build a country that is a country that we would wish to see everybody living in a harmonious and fashion in which they can further their potential. So no, fundamentally, that's not how I see it. But we have to try and engage. And if you don't engage, they will slip back to where they were prior to 2001. We have to give them hope as well as we have to give the young in Afghanistan and young women in Afghanistan that sort of hope.
Thank you for the clarification. Moving on, Women in Defence UK 6 years ago was just starting to gather steam. Our very first Chief's interview was with the newly appointed Chief of the General Staff, Nick Carter, who had just launched the Army's Maximising Talent initiative. 6 years ago, the landscape of women in the armed forces was different to today, but yet very similar to today too. Different in that at that stage, parts of the services were still closed to women on account of their gender, although the recommendations were in place for that to change. And similar in that, and I'll use the Army as an example, the Army's sexual harassment survey painted a depressing picture. I would like to deal separately with the Defence Committee's July report on women in the armed forces. But what are your reflections on how the armed forces have changed for women over the last 6 years?
I mean, first of all, I think it's different across the three services. I think we need to take account of that. I think the first observation I make, speaking from my time as CGS, is that the reason why I launched the idea of a maximising talent campaign was because I wanted it to be for everybody. I wanted to be clear about that, because I fundamentally believe in positive action, not necessarily positive discrimination. Mm-hmm. And I think that at that time, and even now, I think the women in the army would prefer to achieve what they want to achieve on the basis of their own talent. So that's why I wanted to describe it like that. But I was also very horrified at that time that I launched it by what I'd seen in the survey that had been conducted on sexual harassment and bullying, harassment and discrimination. And I think that that remains a challenge for us. I don't think it has changed as much as it might do, which I'll come back to. Now, the extent to which that pertains in the Air Force and the Navy is different. So the services are generally different. And of course, the civil service is different in all of this. Now, what has changed? I mean, I think the first thing that I think we should all be very proud of is the fact that we made the decision, and I think it's been understood by all, that we would open all of the roles in the armed services, but particularly in the army, up to women. And that makes a very important statement. Now, the extent to which women want to come forward to have a career in all different roles in the armed forces, remains to be seen. But it does make a very, very important statement, I think, that we are about maximising talent across the whole profession. So I think that's the biggest change. But when we think about how we're going to move the dial on all of this, I think there are two angles to it. I think there's culture. And I think it's the cultural bit that takes the longest time to change. As we all know, that trite expression that culture trumps strategy. And culture, so much of that is about leadership. And of course, it's also about holding people to account to lead in the right way, which is why targets are important, things like that. The second part of it, where I do think we have moved the dial, is on the sort of enablers to make this happen. And that's about career structures. It's about reporting systems, appraisal systems. It's about the complaint systems. It's about educating people. It's about setting the right context in which that culture can change. And I think we have moved the dial on some of the enablers. Perhaps not as far as they need to be moved, but the answer is we have moved the dial. But again, it is going to take time, because we are predominantly a bottom-fed set of organizations, to see that coming up through the system at the pace that we'd like it to come through. Now, I think we're increasingly realizing that the career structure, particularly with specialisms, is going to enable lateral entry, which will enable greater diversity within it. But in terms of the sort of command chain, it is going to take more time. And a good indication of this is if you take Major General Sharon Naismith, who's the senior female officer in the British Army now, who has pursued essentially a generalist career rather than a specialist career. She was commissioned, I would have thought, in the early 1990s, 91, say. It has taken probably now 30 years for her to get to where she's got to. So it takes time. But I do think that there is now, momentum in terms of pulling that forward. And I think the enablers are better in place to enable it. The trick now is to move the dial on the culture.
Let's move on. Flexible working or alternative working arrangements seem to be reasonably popular with women in the armed forces. How popular do you sense they've been with men?
I think most people who've come forward to adopt this have probably also not necessarily been in the army, they've been in the other two services. And I think mainly it has been about women. But we live in a world where I think modern partnerships recognize that both parties have a role to play. And I don't think it'll be long before this begins to balance itself out.
If you were starting again as a young lieutenant, so Lieutenant Nick Carter, would you want the opportunity to spend more time with your children?
Definitely. Looking back on my career, I haven't spent nearly enough time with my children. Now, part of that, of course, is since 9/11, we've all been sent to dusty corners of the world for long periods of time. But no, the reality is I think I would do, looking back on it. Now, whether you think that when you're a youngster looking forwards is another matter. But certainly as an old man looking backwards, I wish I had been able to do that.
I wish I had as well, as one of the first mothers to serve, but there we go. And that's great to hear. But I think the challenges faced by the armed forces and lots of other organizations and companies is that whilst great and valuable strides have been made in maternity leave and pay, where they now far outstrip the requirements of the statutory minimum, other types of leaves like paternity leave and paternity pay have fallen behind. As an example, women in the armed forces are entitled to up to 52 weeks leave of maternity. Sorry, women in the armed forces are entitled to up to 52 weeks of maternity leave, with up to half of that effectively on full pay. Men, on the other hand, get 2 weeks paternity leave and pay. This policy disparity almost institutionalizes the belief that childcare is a woman's responsibility. How do we change that? How do we do that?
No, I don't disagree with you. But having said that, I know that when I was having children, I wasn't entitled to any paternity leave. So the dial has moved a little bit, but it probably hasn't moved far enough. And it's something that we should absolutely take account of, because this is about an equality in the partnership. No question about it.
So is it really a question of making sure that childcare is seen as both partners' responsibility?
I mean, at the end of the day, it's down to the individuals in the partnership. It's a personal choice, but we should make it possible for that personal choice to be made, would seem to be the logical answer.
Coming back to culture, the Chief's commitment notes, we each have responsibility to drive change within the frontline commands and within defence. We must embed D&I into our culture. When we spoke 6 years ago, we spoke about the laddish culture in the army. So how do we do this? How do we embed D&I into culture and change that culture?
Well, I think we have to recognise that the culture in the armed forces is very much, you've got to look down through all the different cohorts. And I genuinely believe that the generation that is joining the armed forces at the moment, and probably has done for the last 5 years, see it very differently to my generation, or for that matter, the generation in the middle between the two. So I think there's going to be a natural change to this, because that's the way the young want to lead their lives. What we have to do, I think, as the leadership, and more importantly, what's often probably rather unfairly called the sort of frosted middle, need to recognise that they've got to create space for them to live in the way that they want to live. Recognising, of course, that there are certain circumstances, given the nature of our role as armed forces, where it's challenging to allow that always to happen. But in principle, it should be about unlocking the potential of the generation that matters, which is the upcoming generation, to live their lives more in the way that they want to live their lives, and more in the way that they can see the rest of the world living its life.
So it's also putting in place the enablers that you've already talked about.
No, definitely. And the enablers are important. So, for example, one of the most important things I think we've done in terms of the appraisal system is to put a greater emphasis on some of the qualities that we're looking for in the appraisal system from leadership. And leadership, fundamentally is what this issue is about. And leadership is about recognizing that you should be looking downwards rather than upwards for most of your tenure as a leader. You should be really getting to know the people who you lead, and you should be working out how you can maximize their potential so that collectively the team you're leading is going to deliver a much better effect. And identifying the skills and the personalities and the attributes that are going to encourage people to lead like that, and then rewarding them, is a way you change culture. And the idea of a 180-degree system of reporting is being rolled out at the moment, and it's beginning to have an effect. And it's those sorts of things which I would call the enablers, which fundamentally will help us change the culture.
Thank you. A key aspect of culture is language used by that culture. And when we chatted 6 years ago, I asked you how many times you'd been called ma'am, because women were called sir half a dozen times a day. I had to ring an infantry medical centre earlier this year to try and get hold of a nominee for the awards. And I said, "I'm Angela Owen, Women in Defence UK." "Yes, sir." So it's still out there. It's not quite won that particular battle. But gendered ranks. What about gendered ranks? I understand that some are being reviewed. What's happening with able seaman, aircraftman, kingsman, guardsman, rifleman?
No, I mean, people are looking at it. But in a way, is this the most important issue? I think that what we need to do is we need to make sure we're setting the right context. So yes, certainly a lot of these things are important. But equally, when you walk into the army headquarters, you see some wonderful historic photographs. They're mainly of men. In fact, they're all of men. And indeed, you look at the photographs on the wall in this building, they're all of men. It's these sorts of context things which need to be set. And what we've got to do is we've got to aspire to a culture where women don't feel they have to behave like men in order to succeed. That's the most important thing we have to do. And I think that we can attach perhaps too much to certain things like you're describing. If they're offensive, then we should probably change them. But if they're not regarded as offensive, then perhaps that's best left alone. There are bigger issues, I think, here at stake in terms of the context and the tone that we set. And that's what we need to focus on.
I totally agree. We've got bigger issues. I probably wouldn't agree on gendered ranks. One final point about the commitment. We are committed to setting a personal example genuinely to improving the lived experience for everyone. How have you, Nick Carter, set a personal example to everyone?
I think one of the things that I realized I was often doing when I chaired meetings was that I wasn't necessarily giving everybody around the table the opportunity to put their perspective on something. And indeed, there was often an occasion when people would talk over people, particularly men talking over women. So I've made a big effort to make sure that that doesn't happen. I've made a big effort to have 2 or 3 mentors who are female, who keep an eye on my behaviors and let me know whether or not I'm doing things inadvertently that are offensive or not inclusive. And it's those sorts of things that I've paid a bit of attention to. And so much of this is about looking at things from other people's perspectives. And I've spent a lot of time reflecting on that to try and make sure that as I lead, I do so in a way that is genuinely thoughtful.
Can we move to the Defence Select Committee report, Women in the Armed Forces? A wide-ranging report covering recruitment and retention incidences where female serving personnel are the victim of sexual offences and are overrepresented within the complaints system, and bullying, harassment, and so on. Too many topics to cover in one interview. Now, as you know, I'm an Army veteran, and when discussing the report with other Army veterans, particularly the bullying and harassment part, many of us were not in the slightest bit surprised by it. And I think our reaction was one of, yes, and is anything actually going to change? Why is this report going to make a difference?
I think there have been a number of reports over the last year. People have talked a lot about Mike Wigston's report, which he did before he became the Chief of the Air Staff. And that's recently been reviewed by Danuta Gray, who's has been our leading NED on HR, human resources issues, for some time now. And this Select Committee report follows it. The answer is, I think, that the fact that these reports are being written is a good thing, because I think it keeps this particular issue in people's psyche, and that's really important. I do think, from what we've been talking about in this interview, that you will have got the sense that we are changing things. As I said to you at the very beginning, we're not changing the culture as quickly as I would like to change the culture. And I think it's particularly regrettable that so much of what appears in that Select Committee report are women believing that they do not have an environment in which they can genuinely make a complaint. And that, I think, is very worrying. And one of the reasons why our Chiefs of Staff commitment focuses on that aspect, the service complaint system, is because we have to construct a service complaint system which makes it possible for people to come forward when they feel that they are being bullied, harassed, or discriminated against, or whatever is the appropriate term for how they find themselves. And I think, again, that's about culture, but it's also about us creating the context and the conditions in which that can happen. So no, I welcome the report. I think it's a very helpful reminder of what it's like to be a young woman in our armed services at the moment. And actually, it's a good thing for our leaders to look at and to realize that it's entirely unacceptable. If we are going to be operationally effective in the future, we will be cutting our nose off to spite our face if we don't maximize the talent of everybody who's available to us. It is about operational effectiveness fundamentally. It's also about the treatment of people, but it's fundamentally about our collective effectiveness. And we will be getting that badly wrong. So the more often that these reports come out, the more useful it is, I think, to goad people to recognise that these are issues that, frankly, can't be pushed under the carpet.
I'd like to pick up on two topics from the report. First is ill-fitting female uniform and equipment, and then secondly, the report recommendation that the MOD must establish a central defence authority. Starting with uniform, trying to get properly fitting uniform for women was a problem when I joined the army 45 years ago. As I understand it, the main issue seems to be that sizing of some uniforms and body armour and helmets is based on out-of-date and unrepresentative male data. Women are not small men. That says, there does seem to be some progress. I understand body armour plates have been redesigned to be smaller and lighter, and work is in hand to deliver a new design for body armour to take those plates. Importantly, work is also ongoing to capture the body measurements and diversity of the existing armed forces, and I think that's due to report in 2023. Even when that research reports, it has to fight for funding to design and procure those new supplies. What's your sense of the future for female uniform and equipment? Dare women really believe that they will soon have uniform and equipment that's designed for them and not essentially a hand-me-down from their big brothers?
No, I mean, the answer is I think that it's right for them to hope for that. And I think that there is a recognition now, going back to my point about enablers and the context we set, that these are the sorts of things that are irritants and are the things why people, when you aggregate it all up, perhaps don't want to serve a full career. And that's not acceptable.
Let's move on to the establishment of a central defence authority. I think it would be fair to say that the Defence Authority question has divided opinions. One of the recommendations of the Wigston report on inappropriate behaviours was the establishment of a defence authority responsible for culture and inappropriate behaviours. Listening to the evidence given to the committee by the Ministry of Defence, the opinion of the MOD seems to be that the establishment of the new Diversity and Inclusion Directorate, coupled with the existing service complaints system, has met that remit. The Select Committee makes a different recommendation, that the MOD must establish a central defence authority which should provide a reporting and investigation system outside of the chain of command and outside of the single services for bullying, harassment and discrimination complaints. In particular, it should remove the chain of command entirely from any complaint of a sexual nature, criminal or non-criminal. What's your view?
I mean, this, of course, is a complex issue, isn't it? And going back to what I've been saying about leadership, I mean, in an ideal world, your complaint system would perhaps get to a point where nobody made complaints because your leadership was so effective that you seal the complaint before it occurred, if you see what I mean. You'd prevent it from happening. And I think that's where we should be focusing our effort. It's got to be staged. The first step is to make sure you've got a complaint system that people feel is effective. And effective means that it's A, transparent, and B, means that people can go to it without feeling that they're going to get some form of inadvertent retribution about doing it. But it's also got to get to a point where leaders recognize that there is something that could become a complaint if they don't lead properly. So I think there's two things going on here. And I think what we need to make sure is that we don't absolve the chain of command of leading effectively by having off to one side some form of complaint system that is not connected to the chain of command. So I think there's a debate to be had about that. And I don't want the chain of command to absolve itself of the responsibility that it has to make sure that it looks downwards and that it looks after all those people that it is commanding. Now, I also think that, having a separate defence authority that all goes with it may be something that's worth looking at. But let's do this incrementally. Let's see what happens through having a much better D&I set up in the centre of defence. Let's look at where we're going with some of the advice we're getting from the Ombudswoman at the moment about how that occurs. Let's look at how the refinements that we're making to the complaints system at the moment. So let's see how that improves things, because we are changing that pretty significantly, and that's underway at the moment. Let's see how all that comes together. Let's be really alert to it, but let's leap to some central bureaucracy just yet. If we fail on all the things that I've described, then maybe that has to be the answer. But my own view is that the armed services work much better when you when you're changing culture and you're decentralizing and you're empowering leaders to behave as leaders should behave in relation to everybody that they're leading.
Do you have a time limit on your head for this?
No, but I mean, I think one of the things that our Chiefs of Staff commitment has said is that we are going to report back every 6 months. And I think you have to keep an eye on this every 6 months. You need to be clear about what you're trying to do and then keep coming back to it. And the point is, when you launched 10 years ago and we talked 5 years after that, none of that was in place. I cannot remember a time in my 8 years now as a Chief of Staff when the Chiefs signed up to anything collectively. This is the first thing that they've signed up to collectively. And that's a bit of a blow for freedom as far as I'm concerned.
Just a couple of general questions. You finish shortly as CDS, and when you've got some space between you and the role, and I'm going to ask you now to do hindsight, which is a very exact science, do you think you'll reflect on any one particular time during your service and say, do you know what? That was when the tipping point happened for diversity. That's when it all started to change, to get better, not just for gender, but for diversity and inclusion across the board.
I mean, I think the gender thing has changed incrementally, certainly in the army. You go back to 91 when the Women's Royal Army Corps got folded up, and we began to open other professions and arms and services to women. But it then took us a very long time, didn't it, before we moved to some of the combat support arms being available. So it's been an incremental journey. I think for me, getting the combat roles over the line against a lot of personal criticism that I received as CGS for that, I think that was a big moment for me in terms of moving the dial. But I think for me, to be honest, it wasn't really until I became CGS and I read that report into bullying, harassment and discrimination and realized quite how counterproductive the culture and the environment was in the army, that I realized that it needed to be something that I focused on properly. And that is something, and that's probably the first time that I was in a position where I genuinely could make a difference as well. So that I think for me was probably a defining moment.
And one last question, if I may, please, some advice. It's the 10th anniversary of Women in Defence UK. We'd always hoped that we'd be able to write ourselves out of business one day, that we would no longer be needed, but we're not there yet. How can Women in Defence UK best serve defence? And do you think we're still going to be needed in 10 years' time?
The answer to your second question is I hope not, but I sadly wouldn't be surprised if you are. And I think the way that you can help is to continue, I think, to, it's the wrong term, but hold people to account for their actions. And that's why, the Chiefs of Staff commitment is important, I think, because it provides a set of targets that you can hold people to account against, both in cultural terms, but also in terms of the enablements that I've been talking about. But no, I mean, I think the most important thing that you can do is you can give heart to all those women who join the armed services and want to have a career, that actually there are a lot of other women in the armed services going through the same sorts of things that they're going through. And one of the things that I was most proud of when we set up the Army Women's Network was the fact that how many men joined it. And to my mind, once we've got to a position where, there is no distinction, we've cracked it. And I think that, what you do to help that cultural shift and to encourage those women who are, in a sense, breaking these glass ceilings on a daily basis, that's the most helpful thing you can do.
Thank you for that. And thank you for your honesty and transparency yet again. I've really enjoyed chatting with you, and I very, very much appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela, very much. And good luck for the network in the future as well.